Now, let's step back and summarize the connectivity of the cerebellar system on a somewhat larger scale. The major inputs to the cerebellar system come from the cortex and also from the spinal cord via the pontine nucleus and the inferior olive. Each granule cell gets inputs from a small number of neurons in the pontine nucleus, but one Purkinje cell gets inputs from 100,000 or more granule cells. One Purkinje gets inputs from just one inferior olive neuron. Purkinje cells are inhibitive and target cerebellar nuclei neurons. The cerebellar nuclei neurons also get inputs from both the pontine nucleus and the inferior olive. The outputs from the inhibitory neurons in the nuclei target the inferior olive, but the excitatory neurons target the thalamus and or the spinal cord to drive muscle movements directly. And these outputs to the thalamus and the spinal cord are the only major outputs going outside this cerebellar system. This shows the connectivity on a slightly larger scale, with emphasis here on the control of motor behaviors. And it shows that there are parallel paths by which motor behaviors can be controlled. This is the path from the cortex to the basal ganglia, on to the thalamus, which then influences the release of motor cortex outputs to the brainstem and the spinal cord. But there's also the path we've just been discussing, from the motor cortex through the pontine nuclei and the cerebellum, also out to the brainstem and the spinal cord. And there's a variant in which the cerebellum targets the thalamus, which could in turn affect the release of cortex outputs, perhaps including the motor cortex outputs to the spinal cord, although it's possible that this path is more concerned with higher cognitive behaviors and targets different cortical areas from the motor cortex. And there are some links between the paths. The cerebellar nuclei target neurons in the striatum of the basal ganglia, and the subthalamic nucleus in the basal ganglia targets the cerebellar cortex.